They said it was impossible. He said he'd need until morning. The engineers had already left for the night, laughing. They didn't know who they'd handed the keys to. They said it was impossible. He said he'd need until morning. The engineers had already left for the night, laughing. The sound of it bounced off the corrugated metal walls of Hangar 7, a hollow, dismissive thing that followed the last of them through the side door. One of them, a young man with a tablet and a brand-new leather jacket, had actually clapped Mike on the shoulder as he passed. "Good luck, Mikey. Try not to trip over the mop." The door slammed shut. The laughter faded into the parking lot. They didn't know who they'd handed the keys to. Mike Carter stood alone in the hangar. The grounded passenger jet loomed above him, its bulk casting a long shadow under the harsh fluorescent lights. The engine cowling on the left wing was still open, a tangle of wires and hoses spilling out like the guts of a mechanical beast. The air smelled of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the particular cold of a concrete space that had been empty for hours. He didn't move for a long moment. He just stood there, hands in the pockets of his faded navy blue janitor's uniform, the white name patch reading Mike, catching the light. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then he walked to the metal workbench, set down the dented green toolbox with the red handle, and unlatched it with a deliberate click. The sound was precise, final. It was the sound of a man starting work that no one believed he could finish. His hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was the first thing his wife had noticed about him, back when he was 23, and terrified of everything except the inside of a jet engine. She had watched him assemble a model turbine in their tiny apartment, his fingers moving with a surgical precision that made her laugh. "You have the hands of a watchmaker," she had said, "but you fix things that weigh 40,000 pounds. He had kissed her then, and the model had sat unfinished on the table for 3 days. That was a long time ago. Before the hospital. Before the final bill. Before the corner office became a memory and the janitor's uniform became the only thing that fit his life. He pulled a frayed notebook from the toolbox. The cover was stained with grease and years of thumbprints. He opened it to a page of hand-drawn schematics. The ink faded, but the lines still precise. His thumb traced a route through the fuel system, following a path he had walked 1,000 times in his mind. The engineers had missed something. He could feel it, the same way a musician can hear a wrong note in a symphony that everyone else calls perfect. He looked from the notebook to the exposed engine. The diagnostic readout they had left behind was still glowing on a laptop card. The screen showed a fault code he had seen before, back when he was the man who designed the system that was now failing. The engineers had called it a sensor error. They had ordered a replacement part that would take 3 days to arrive. They had laughed at the janitor who offered to take a look. Mike Carter knew it wasn't a sensor. He knew it the way you know the sound of your own child's cough in the middle of the night. It was the fuel manifold, a hairline fracture, invisible to the diagnostic software, forming along the weld line of a component he had redesigned himself 12 years ago in a different life. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out a small Ziploc bag. Inside was a replacement manifold, machined to his own specifications, built in a garage workshop on the other side of town. He had made 2 of them. He always made 2 of everything. That was something his wife had teased him about, back when teasing was still possible. "You would back up a sunrise if you could," she had said. He had smiled and said nothing, because she was right, and because the sunrise had been her face in the morning light, and he would have backed that up if he had known how. The hangar was silent except for the hum of a distant fan. He set the replacement manifold on the workbench and began removing the access panels on the engine. His hands moved with a rhythm that was older than the uniform, older than the grief. He had rebuilt his first engine at 19, a salvage job from a decommissioned cargo plane that his mentor, an old engineer named Marcus, had let him touch. Marcus had stood behind him, arms crossed, saying nothing, until the engine turned over for the first time. Then he had grunted, "Told you. The machine tells you what's wrong if you listen right." Mike listened now. The engine was telling him a story of stress and heat and a tiny flaw that had grown over years of cycles. He could almost see the crack forming, grain by grain, under the pressure of 1,000 takeoffs. He had designed the manifold to last 10,000 cycles. It had made it to 12,000. It had done its job. Now he was here to give it a second life. He worked in silence, the only sounds the click of wrenches and the occasional rustle of pages as he checked his notes. The clock on the hangar wall read 10:47 p.m. when he started. By midnight he had the old manifold out. By 1:30 he had the new one seated and torqued to spec. He worked like a man who had all the time in the world, but also like a man who knew exactly how much time he didn't have. In his mind, he was in two places at once. One part of him was in the hangar, running diagnostics, checking tolerances, his breath misting in the cold air. The other part was in a different room, a smaller one, with beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic. He was holding her hand, and her hand was lighter than it should have been, and she was smiling at him with a smile that was trying to be brave for his sake. "Take care of Lily," she had said. Her voice was a thread. "Promise me." He had promised. He had meant it. And that promise had led him here, to a janitor's uniform and a midnight shift and a jet engine that no one else could fix. Because the janitor job let him pick Lily up at 3 o'clock. Because the janitor job let him be there for every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every nightmare that sent her padding into his room at 2 in the morning. Because the janitor job was the only thing that fit around the shape of his life, which was the shape of his daughter. He tightened the last bolt on the fuel manifold at 2:47 a.m. He sat back on his heels, his knees aching, his hands black with grease. The engine was whole again. He connected the diagnostic laptop, ran a full sequence, and watched the readout flicker from red to amber to a steady, unbroken green. He didn't smile. He just nodded. Once. The way Marcus used to nod when a job was done right. Then he reached into the toolbox and pulled out a photograph. It was creased and worn, the edges soft from years of being held. His wife, holding Lily as a baby, both of them laughing at something off camera. Her hair was longer then. Her eyes were bright. She was wearing the blue dress he had bought her for their anniversary, the one she said was too expensive, the one she wore to every important occasion afterward. He touched her face with his thumb. The photograph was warm from being close to his chest, inside the toolbox, beneath the tools. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the photograph didn't already know. He slid it back into the leather folder, beneath the patent certificates, and closed the toolbox. The hangar was quiet. The engine was ready. All it needed was power, and the morning, and the return of the men who had laughed. The clock on the hangar wall read 2:47 a.m. Mike tightened the last bolt on the fuel manifold, then sat back on his heels. He reached into the toolbox and pulled out a photograph. His wife, holding Lily as a baby, both of them laughing. He touched her face with his thumb, then slid the photo back into the folder. The engine was ready. All it needed was power. He stood, stretching his back, the joints popping in a way that reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. The hangar was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights, a sound so constant it had become invisible. Mike walked to the workbench, picked up the diagnostic laptop, and connected it to the engine's control module. The screen flickered to life, a cascade of data streams and sensor readings. He scrolled through them slowly, methodically, his eyes moving with the precision of a man who had once built these systems from scratch. The fuel manifold was the heart of the problem, a hairline crack, invisible to the naked eye, running along the casting seam. It was a design flaw he'd seen before, back when he was still in the game, still sitting in conference rooms with engineers who nodded at his words and then ignored them. The crack would widen under pressure, starving the engine of fuel during takeoff. The engineers had missed it because they hadn't looked. They'd run the diagnostic, seen the error code, and blamed the software. They'd never even opened the cowling. Mike had. He'd listened to the engine the way his mentor Marcus had taught him. The machine tells you what's wrong if you listen right. Marcus was 73 now, retired to a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, his hands still stained with grease despite a decade away from the hangar. He taught Mike that the sound of a failing manifold was different from a failing sensor. A sensor whined, a manifold whispered. This one had whispered. Mike replaced the manifold with a new unit from the inventory shelf. The engineers hadn't even noticed it was gone. He'd calibrated the fuel pressure, adjusted the timing, and run the sequence 3 times. Each time, the readout flickered green. The engine was ready. He sat on the workbench, the photograph still in his hand. The edges were worn soft from handling, the corners rounded from being carried in his pocket for 5 years. His wife's name was Sarah. She had died on a Tuesday, at 3:14 in the afternoon, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Mike had been holding her hand when the monitor flatlined. He remembered the sound it made, a single, sustained tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He remembered the nurse touching his shoulder, saying words he couldn't hear. He remembered the way Sarah's hand had gone cold, the wedding ring still warm against his skin. He had promised her, in that room, that he would raise Lily to be brave, that he would never let her forget her mother's laugh, or the way she hummed when she cooked, or the dress she had sewn for Lily's first birthday, with hand-stitched daisies along the hem. That dress was still in Lily's closet, wrapped in tissue paper, brought out on the hard days. Mike had kept that promise. Every day, for 5 years, he had kept it. The hangar door was still closed. The engineers wouldn't be back until morning. Mike had 5 hours. He used them. He checked the oil lines, the hydraulic seals, the avionics bay. He found a loose connector in the navigation system and tightened it. He found a frayed wire in the landing gear assembly and replaced it. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, his hands moving faster than his mind could follow. Muscle memory. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. At 4:30, he stopped for coffee. The break room was a small alcove off the main hangar, with a microwave, a sink, and a percolator that had been there since the 1990s. Mike poured a cup, black, no sugar, and stood at the window looking out at the runway. The airport was quiet at this hour, the tarmac lit by the cold blue glow of sodium lamps. A single cargo plane was taxiing toward the terminal, its engines a low rumble that vibrated through the glass. He thought about the engineers, their laughter, their dismissal, the way they had looked at him like he was furniture. He didn't feel anger. He hadn't felt anger in years. What he felt was something quieter, something that sat in his chest like a stone. He had been them once. He had been the one with the coffee and the smirk in the corner office. He had been the one who didn't look twice at the janitor. And then Sarah got sick. And the company, the one he had helped build, the one that held his 7 patents, had told him he couldn't take leave, that the project was too important, that they needed him in the office, not in the hospital. He had walked out that same day. He had never gone back. The patents were his. The company tried to claim them, but the contracts were ironclad. Mike had written them himself. He had walked away with nothing but his name and his daughter and a toolbox full of memories. He had taken the janitor job because it paid cash, because it let him pick Lily up at 3, because it required nothing from him except his hands. He had never expected to use his hands again. But here he was. 4:47 a.m., a jet engine purring on a diagnostic screen. The head of engineering sleeping in his bed, dreaming of bonuses and promotions, unaware that the man he had mocked was about to save his career. Mike set down the coffee cup and walked back to the engine. He ran the diagnostic one more time, watching the numbers flicker across the screen. Temperature, optimal. Pressure, optimal. Flow rate, optimal. Every reading green, every parameter within spec. The engine was not just fixed, it was better than new. He closed the laptop, packed his tools, and wiped down the workbench with a rag from his pocket. The hangar was immaculate. No trace of his presence except the closed cowling and the silence of a machine that no longer whispered. At 5:30, he sat on the workbench and waited. The photograph was back in the folder back in the toolbox. He didn't need to look at it again. He knew every line of Sarah's face, every curve of Lily's smile. He carried them with him, always. In the space behind his sternum where the grief had settled into something almost bearable. The hangar doors rumbled open. A shaft of pale morning light cut across the concrete floor. Mike stood beside the jet, hands in his pockets, toolbox at his feet. The head of engineering walked in, coffee in hand, still smirking. Then he saw the engine cowling closed, saw the tool marks on the bolts, saw the janitor standing there, waiting. The smirk didn't fall. It froze, a half smile that hung on his face like a mask that no longer fit. He looked at Mike. He looked at the engine. He looked at the diagnostic laptop, still warm on the workbench. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Mike checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. He had time. He always made time. The clock on the hangar wall read 2:47 a.m. Mike tightened the last bolt on the fuel manifold, then sat back on his heels. The cold of the concrete seeped through the knees of his uniform, a familiar ache he'd learned to ignore. He reached into the dented green toolbox and pulled out a photograph. His wife, holding Lily as a baby, both of them laughing. The image was creased along the edges, worn soft from years of being touched. His thumb found her face, traced the curve of her smile. He remembered the day it was taken. A Sunday in June, the backyard of their first house, the air thick with the smell of cut grass. She'd been wearing a yellow sundress. Lily had grabbed a fistful of her hair and she'd laughed, that sound that could fill any room. He slid the photograph back into the leather folder, beneath the patent certificates. The brass wedding ring on his left hand caught the dim light as he closed the lid. The engine was ready. All it needed was power. He stood slowly, his knees protesting. The hangar was a cathedral of silence, the only sound the distant hum of a ventilation fan and the occasional drip of condensation from a pipe overhead. Mike walked to the cockpit access ladder, climbed the 3 steps, and settled into the pilot's seat. The harness hung loose against his chest. He'd never flown a jet, but he knew every system in this one. He'd designed half of them. His hands moved across the overhead panel, flipping switches with a practiced rhythm. Battery master, inverter, fuel pump. The instrument panel came alive, needles sweeping across dials, digital readouts flickering to green. He found the engine start sequence and pressed the button. A low whine filled the cockpit. The turbines began to turn, building speed, the sound rising in pitch. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught with a smooth roar that vibrated through the airframe. The needles on the temperature gauges climbed into the green arc and held steady. Mike listened. not just with his ears, but with his hands on the throttle, his feet on the rudder pedals. He was reading the machine the way Marcus had taught him. Marcus, the old engineer who'd taken him under his wing when Mike was 22, fresh out of college and too smart for his own good. Marcus had a bucket-sized coffee mug that he never washed, just refilled. He'd taught Mike that the machine tells you what's wrong if you listen right. Not with your ears, with your hands, the vibration in the control column, the hesitation in the throttle response, the way the engine breathes. Mike throttled back to idle, then shut the engine down. The whine faded into silence. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, eyes closed, letting the quiet settle around him. The fuel manifold was fixed. The engine would hold. But the repair wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that he'd been listened to. The engineers had laughed. They'd handed him the keys as a joke. But they'd also handed him the logbook, and he'd read it cover to cover before they'd even left the hangar. He climbed down from the cockpit and walked back to the workbench. The laptop was still connected to the diagnostic port. He pulled up the engine history, scrolling through the data logs. The fuel manifold crack had been there for weeks. The engineers had run the diagnostic 3 times and missed it each time, not because the test was wrong, but because they hadn't been looking. They'd assumed the problem was in the avionics, so they'd only checked the avionics. The machine had told them the truth. They just hadn't listened. Mike closed the laptop and packed his tools. The dented green toolbox was lighter now, the wrenches and screwdrivers nested in their foam cutouts. He lifted it off the workbench and set it on the floor beside the jet's main landing gear. Then he walked to the hangar wall and pressed the button to open the doors. The motors whirred. The corrugated metal doors began to roll upward, inch by inch. A shaft of pale morning light cut across the concrete floor, widening into a rectangle of gray dawn. The airport was waking up. He could hear the distant rumble of a 737 taxiing on the tarmac. Mike stood beside the jet, hands in his pockets, toolbox at his feet. The faded navy blue uniform was streaked with grease, the white name patch reading Mike still clean. He hadn't slept. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slumped, but he was standing straight, waiting. The head of engineering walked in, coffee in hand, still smirking. His name was Dennis. He was a stocky man in a rumpled navy suit jacket, his receding hair combed over, a silver watch on his wrist. He'd been the one who handed Mike the keys the night before, laughing with his team as they filed out. Then he saw the engine cowling closed, saw the tool marks on the bolts, saw the janitor standing there, waiting. The smirk faltered. Dennis stopped mid-stride, coffee sloshing over his hand. He didn't seem to notice. He stared at the jet, then at Mike, then back at the jet. The engine cowling was closed. The access panels were flush. The tools were packed. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint smell of aviation fuel and the sheen of oil on the concrete. Dennis set his coffee on the workbench. He walked around the jet, running his hand over the cowling, checking the seals. He opened the access panel for the diagnostic port and plugged in his laptop. The engine history loaded. The fuel manifold crack was gone. The replacement was logged with Mike's employee ID. The temperature readings were stable. The compression ratios were within spec. He stood up slowly, his face pale. His blue eyes found Mike's. They were the color of a winter sky. "What did you do?" Mike spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, measured. "The fuel manifold had a hairline crack. I replaced it. The engine will hold." "You're a janitor." "I'm a mechanic." Dennis stared at him. The silence stretched into seconds. The other engineers began to arrive, filing through the open hangar door, coffee cups and clipboards in hand. They saw Dennis standing frozen. They saw the janitor beside the jet. They saw the closed engine cowling. One of them, a younger engineer with a tablet, opened the diagnostic software. He scrolled through the data, his eyes widening. The fuel manifold's been replaced. The calibration is perfect. The engine is fully operational. A murmur rippled through the group. The assistant who had handed Mike the keys the night before, a woman in a blue airport blazer, stepped forward. Her hand drifted to her mouth. She looked at Mike, then at Dennis, then back at Mike. "Who is this guy?" she whispered. Dennis didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, his thumb trembling slightly as he dialed. He held it to his ear. The line connected. "Sir, you need to come to Hangar 7, right now." Mike didn't move. He just checked his watch. 6:43 a.m. He had 20 minutes to get home, shower, and wake Lily for school. The brass ring on his finger caught the morning light. His wife's laugh echoed in his memory. He picked up the dented green toolbox and started walking toward the hangar door. The engineers parted to let him through, their eyes following him. He didn't look back. He had a daughter to wake. The hangar doors rumbled open. A shaft of pale morning light cut across the concrete floor, splitting the dim fluorescent glow into two worlds, the night that had passed and the day that was about to begin. Mike Carter stood beside the jet, hands in his pockets, the dented green toolbox at his feet. His posture was slightly stooped, the same hands in pockets shuffle he'd used when he walked in 10 hours ago. The only difference was the engine cowling, closed, sealed, ready. The head of engineering walked in first, a paper coffee cup in his hand, steam rising in the cold hangar air. He was still smirking, still carrying the same dismissive energy from the night before, the kind of energy that only exists in men who have never been wrong about anything that mattered. He took a sip of his coffee, looked at the jet, and stopped mid-step. The smirk didn't vanish. It froze, then began to crack at the edges. He saw the closed engine cowling, saw the tool marks on the bolts, clean, precise, the work of someone who knew exactly how much torque each fastener required. Saw the diagnostic laptop connected to the engine control unit, a single green line running across the screen. Saw the janitor standing there waiting. "What did you do?" The head of engineering's voice was flat. Not angry. Not yet. Just confused, the way a man gets confused when a machine he dismissed as broken suddenly works. Mike didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the same frayed one he'd been writing in all night. He flipped it open to a page covered in tight, precise handwriting. Numbers, angles, pressure readings. The muscle memory of a man who had spent 15 years writing this language before anyone told him he wasn't allowed to. "The fuel manifold had a hairline crack," Mike said. His voice was quiet, even. The same voice he used when Lily asked him to read her a bedtime story. Right at the junction between the secondary feed and the combustion chamber. The engineers who checked it last week ran a standard pressure test, but the crack only opened under thermal load. At operating temperature, the metal expands, the crack widens, and you lose about 12% fuel pressure to the third stage turbine. The engine would still start, but it wouldn't hold altitude above 25,000 feet. Not without flaming out. He said it the way a mechanic describes a loose bolt. Simple, technical, final. The head of engineering stared at him. The coffee cup was still in his hand, but he wasn't drinking from it anymore. He was just holding it, his knuckles white around the cardboard. "How do you know that?" Mike closed the notebook. "Because I designed the manifold." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It pressed down on the hangar, filled the space between the concrete floor and the steel rafters. 2 other engineers had walked in during Mike's explanation, and they were standing frozen, their tool belts half on, their mouths slightly open. One of them, a younger man with a crew cut and a confused frown, stepped forward. He reached the diagnostic laptop, looked at the screen, and his face went pale. The engine's showing full operational status. All parameters in the green. It's ready. The head of engineering turned to look at the screen. His coffee cup tipped slightly, spilling a few drops onto the concrete. He didn't notice. "That's impossible," he said. Mike didn't argue. He just waited. It was the same waiting move he'd used at the reception desk, at the gate, at every point of dismissal in his life. He waited because he knew that the truth didn't need defending. It only needed time. The younger engineer with the crew cut was already pulling up the maintenance logs on the laptop. His fingers moved fast, scrolling through dates and signatures. He stopped at a page, read something, and looked up at Mike with an expression that was part awe and part fear. The last time this engine was overhauled was 2008. The work order says it was done by a contractor called Carter Aerospace Engineering. He paused. Signed by Michael Carter. The head of engineering's face did something complicated. It went through confusion, then recognition, then a slow, dawning horror that settled into his features like a stain. "Carter," he repeated. "The Carter. The one with the 7 patents." No one answered. They didn't need to. The patents were in the toolbox, in the leather folder, stamped with the FAA seal. But they were also written into the engine itself, into every component that Mike had designed, tested, and certified with his own hands. The jet had been carrying his work for 15 years. The engineers just hadn't known to look for his name. Mike checked his watch. 6:43 a.m. 20 minutes to get home. 20 minutes to shower, change out of the faded Navy uniform, and wake Lily for school. She liked to be woken gently, with the curtains opened slowly so the light crept in instead of flooding. She had asked for that after her mother died, and Mike had never forgotten. "I need to go," he said. The head of engineering stepped forward, blocking his path. Not aggressively, more like a man trying to stop a door from closing. "Wait. You can't just leave. We need to talk about this. We need to understand what happened here." Mike looked at him. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "What happened is that your team missed a crack in a fuel manifold that I designed 12 years ago. What happened is that you handed the keys to a janitor because you thought he was nobody. What happened is that I fixed your jet." He picked up the dented green toolbox by its red handle. "I'm not looking for a job. I'm not looking for credit. I'm looking for the bus that gets me home before my daughter wakes up alone." The head of engineering pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking slightly, the first time Mike had seen any vulnerability in the man. "Sir, you need to come to Hangar 7. Right now." A pause. "Just come." Mike didn't move. He just checked his watch again. 6:47 a.m. 16 minutes. The head of engineering ended the call. "The CEO is on his way. He wants to meet you. And I want to pick up my daughter. Can this wait until after?" The question hung in the air. The other engineers were watching, their eyes moving between the janitor and their boss, trying to understand the shift in gravity that had just occurred. The head of engineering opened his mouth, closed it, then stepped aside. Mike walked past him, the toolbox swinging at his side. He reached the hangar door, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. "The engine will hold, but you should replace the manifold entirely within the next 3 months. The crack was a stress fracture, which means the metal has fatigued. It's safe for now, but it won't last forever." He walked out into the morning light, the sun low and golden, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Behind him, the hangar was silent. The engineers stood around the jet, staring at the closed cowling, the diagnostic screen, the empty space where the janitor had been. The head of engineering pulled out his phone, called the CEO. "Sir, you need to come to Hangar 7. Right now." Mike didn't hear the rest. He was already walking toward the bus stop, the dented green toolbox in his hand, the brass wedding ring catching the light. He had 16 minutes to get home. He was going to make every second count. The head of engineering pulled out his phone, called the CEO. "Sir, you need to come to Hangar 7, right now." Mike didn't move. He just checked his watch. 6:43 a.m. He had 20 minutes to get home, shower, and wake Lily for school. The hangar filled with a silence that had weight. The engineers stood frozen, their coffee cups forgotten, their smirks dissolved. One of them, the youngest, the one who had handed Mike the keys the night before, stepped forward and peered at the diagnostic screen. The numbers were green, all of them. The engine was not just operational. It was running at 102% efficiency, a calibration that should have taken a team of 3 specialists 2 full shifts to achieve. "How?" the young engineer whispered, not to Mike, not to anyone, just to the screen, as if it might answer him. Mike did not answer. He lifted the dented green toolbox by its red handle, the weight of it familiar in his hand. He walked toward the hangar door, his scuffed black work boots echoing on the gray concrete floor. The hands in pockets shuffle was gone. His posture had straightened, not from pride, but from the simple fact that the work was done. The hangar door was still rolling open when the CEO arrived. A man in his late 50s, silver hair, a suit that cost more than Mike's monthly rent 10 years ago. He stepped out of a black sedan and stopped when he saw the janitor walking toward him. "Mike?" The CEO's voice cracked on the name. "Mike Carter?" Mike stopped. He set the toolbox down. He looked at the CEO with tired hazel eyes, the same eyes that had watched his wife die, the same eyes that had watched his daughter learn to walk, the same eyes that had watched 7 patents get filed and forgotten. "Hello, Richard." The CEO took a step back. "I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know you were working here." "No one did," Mike said. That was the point. The CEO looked past him at the jet, at the closed engine cowling, at the diagnostic screen still glowing green. "You fixed it. In one night. The same engine that grounded the entire fleet." The fuel manifold had a hairline crack. It was a manufacturing defect from the batch we recalled in 2009. I recognized the serial number on the part when I saw it on the workbench. The engineers who inspected it didn't know what they were looking at because they never learned the history of the component. Mike paused. "Marcus taught me that. Every part has a story. You have to know the story to fix the machine." The CEO's face went pale. "Marcus, your old mentor. He retired 5 years ago." "He taught me everything," Mike said, "including how to read a diagnostic that someone else already ran. The engineers had a reading in their log that showed the crack. They just didn't know what it meant. They dismissed it as a sensor error because the manual said the manifold couldn't crack in that location. But it did. It always does, if you run the engine at full thrust for more than 3 hours. That's what my patent was for. The redesign that prevents that exact crack." The CEO stared at him. "You patented the fix for the crack you found. I found the crack in 2008 during a test flight over the Pacific. I filed the patent the next week. The company shelved it because the redesign would have cost $3 million to implement across the fleet. They chose to save the money and hope the crack never appeared." Mike picked up the toolbox. It appeared. It always does. A silence stretched between them, filled by the distant hum of a jet taxiing on the runway. The engineers had gathered at the hangar door watching. The young assistant with the clipboard had her hand over her mouth. The 2 hangar mechanics in coveralls stood with their arms crossed, their faces unreadable. "Come back," the CEO said, his voice low. "Name your salary. Name your title. I'll give you anything. The corner office. A team of 40 engineers. Whatever you want." Mike looked at his watch. 6:51 a.m. He had 12 minutes. "I need to pick up my daughter," he said. "Can this wait until after?" The CEO opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Your daughter, Lily, she's 8. She has a school concert tonight. I promised I'd be there." Mike picked up the toolbox. "The engine is fixed. It will hold for the next 10,000 flight hours if you replace the manifold every 18 months. I wrote the maintenance schedule on a notepad inside the engine bay. It's in the logbook. Tell your engineers to read it." He turned and walked toward the hangar exit, the dented green toolbox swinging at his side. The engineers parted to let him pass. No one spoke. The young assistant whispered something to the man beside her, but Mike didn't hear it. He was already thinking about Lily, about the dress she had picked out for the concert, about the way she held his hand too tightly when she was nervous. The taxi was waiting at the gate. Mike slid into the back seat, the toolbox beside him, the worn leather folder still tucked inside. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror. "Long night?" "Long enough," Mike said. The taxi pulled away from the airport, the terminal lights sliding past. Mike leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. The brass wedding ring caught the morning light, a small gleam of gold against the faded navy blue of his uniform. He thought about his wife, about the hospital room, about the promise he had made to her, that he would raise Lily to be brave. He thought about the engineers who had laughed, about the CEO who had forgotten his name, about the 7 patents that sat in a leather folder beneath a set of wrenches. He thought about the jet, alive again, ready to fly. The taxi stopped at a small house on a quiet street. Mike paid the driver, picked up the toolbox, and walked to the front door. He unlocked it and stepped inside. The house was silent. The hallway lit by the blue nightlight that Lily still insisted on having. He walked to her room and pushed the door open. She was asleep, her dark hair spread across the pillow, a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The rabbit had been his wife's. She had given it to Lily on her first birthday, a few months before she died. Mike stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. The toolbox was heavy in his hand. The leather folder was full of patents that could have made him a billionaire. The brass ring on his finger was the only thing that had never changed. He set the toolbox down. He walked to Lily's bed and knelt beside it. He touched her hair, the way he had touched his wife's hair in the hospital bed, the way he had touched the photograph in the hangar. "Hey, Lily," he whispered. "Time to wake up." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy?" "I'm here. I've got breakfast ready. You've got a concert tonight." She smiled, her small hand reaching for his. He took it, feeling the pulse in her wrist, the same pulse he had felt 1,000 times before. "Did you fix the plane?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I fixed it." "Good," she said, and closed her eyes again. Mike stayed there for a long moment, his hand in hers, the morning light growing brighter through the window. The taxi was gone. The hangar was behind him. The jet was ready to fly. But he was already where he needed to be. Mike sat in the back of the taxi, Lily asleep against his shoulder. The CEO's offer echoed in his mind. "Come back. Name your salary." He looked out of the window at the airport shrinking behind them. He touched the brass ring on his finger. "We'll see, Lily. We'll see." The city lights blurred past. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.